All right, get ready, everyone, because today we're diving deep, deep, deep into the science of emotion.
Ooh, emotions. Always a fun one.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? And today we're focusing on how we actually perceive emotions in others. It's like, how do we read the room, so to speak? We've got some research lined up that's going to unpack all the surprising ways our brains, our bodies, heck, even the words we use, all play into this whole emotional intelligence thing.
You know, it's funny because we all just kind of assume we can read each other's emotions. See a smile.
Yeah.
Must be happy, right?
Yeah.
But,
Well, yeah. Isn't that how it works?
well, it turns out not quite. I mean, it's way more complex than that.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with the science.
All right. Well, for starters, think back to those classic textbook diagrams of facial expressions. You know, like anger with the furrowed brow or surprise with the wide eyes. We were practically raised on those, told they're universal.
Yeah, those exaggerated expressions, like they're straight out of a cartoon almost.
Exactly, those over-the-top faces.
Yeah.
But there's this 2007 paper by Barrett, Lindquist, and Gendron, I think it was. Anyway, they point out that those super dramatic expressions, you almost never see them in real-life situations.
Really?
Yeah, like even actors, you know, the people who get paid to be convincing, they don't even make those faces unless a director's telling them to.
Huh. You're right. Never thought of it that way.
There was even this study where they asked people to try and recreate those basic emotion faces, and only like 16% could do it accurately. 16%.
You're kidding. So all those years of reading faces, and it was all basically bogus.
Well, not entirely. What this really shows is that we aren't actually hardwired to just automatically know what someone's feeling based on their face alone. Our brains are way more sophisticated than that. We pick up on subtle things. We think about past experiences, the situation we're in.
So it's like context is key. You can't separate an emotion from the situation or the person.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this.
Yeah.
Get this. Even the words we use can change how we see those emotions.
Wait, hold on. You're saying if someone just says a word like angry, it can change how I interpret a facial expression.
That's what the research suggests, yeah. That same paper by Barrett's team, they found that simply having emotion labels around like sad or excited actually changes our brain activity.
So are you saying that, like, if I see a neutral face but someone whispers sad, my brain just goes, yep, must be sad then?
Basically, it's like the word primes our brain to see that emotion, even if the expression itself is kind of vague. They did this really cool study where they showed people these blended faces, a mix of anger and happiness, and those who saw the faces labeled angry, they rated them as angrier, even though the faces were exactly the same for everyone.
Wow. Okay. That's kind of trippy.
It is, right. And get this, they even found that people saw even more anger if they then had to explain why they thought the face was angry.
That is wild. It's like how if someone describes a dish as like rich and decadent, you might start tasting chocolate even if there's none in it. Our brains just fill in the gaps based on the words.
Precisely. Language is crazy powerful.
Yeah.
It really shapes how our brain interprets the world, even for something that feels as automatic as recognizing emotions.
This is making me rethink so many things. Like, how many times have I totally misread someone because of my own biases or the language I'm used to using?
It's a humbling thought, isn't it? And it just opens up so many more questions. Like, how do our experiences, personally and culturally, how does that play into how we understand each other's emotions?
And are we even aware of it happening half the time?
Right.
Speaking of experiences, what about the role of, like, our own bodies in all of this? I mean, we're not just brains floating around observing the world, right?
Definitely not. And this is where things get even more fascinating. We've got this awesome study from 2003 by Carr and his team that dives right into this. They had participants look at pics of different emotional expressions and then either imitate the expression or just observe it.
So some people were told to basically make the angry face while others just watched.
You got it. And the results were really something else. They found that when the participants actually imitated the emotions, their brains lit up in similar areas as when they were genuinely experiencing those emotions themselves, particularly in the limbic system, which is like the emotional control center of the brain.
Hold up. Are you saying, like, if I scowl back at someone who's scowling at me, my brain doesn't know the difference between their anger and my own? That's kind of hilarious, but also, like, slightly terrifying.
It is pretty wild. And that's where we get into the amazing world of mirror neurons, which we've talked about a bit before. These neurons, they fire both when we do an action and when we watch someone else doing that same action.
Oh, right. So it's like our brains are trying to understand what the other person is feeling by literally acting it out internally.
Exactly. It's like our brains are going, hey, I know what that feels like.
Yeah.
I've made that face before. I've felt that feeling.
That is incredible. It's like our brains are just constantly mirroring the world, trying to make sense of it all through our own experiences.
It's a pretty cool system when you think about it.
Mm.
And while mirror neurons were first discovered, in the context of physical movement and stuff, research is suggesting they might be involved in understanding emotions and even intentions as well.
So it's not just recognizing a smile, it's our brain actually generating a mini version of that feeling of happiness, even if it's totally subconscious.
That's the idea. And this has some pretty amazing implications for how we understand empathy, how we connect socially. But before we get too deep into that rabbit hole, let's talk about familiarity for a sec. Because get this, our brains, they've got this special advantage when it comes to reading the emotions of, well, people we actually know.
Okay, that makes sense, right? Like, I can tell when my best friend's having a bad day just by how she walks in the room, even if she's trying to pretend everything's fine.
Totally. We all have those people we can just read instantly.
Yeah.
And there's this study from 2017 by Matteo Visconti, D'Allegio Costello, and his team. They looked into this. They found that our brains, they actually process familiar faces totally differently to unfamiliar ones.
So it's not just that we know him better, it's like our brains are literally wired to see him differently.
That's what it seems like. Familiar faces, they activate this whole network in our brains associated with social stuff, memories we have of them. Like it's like our brains pull up a file on that person, all those past interactions, and use that to figure out their expressions.
Like a secret decoder ring, but for people. That's pretty cool. But does that mean, like, if we're relying on those memories, couldn't we get misled sometimes? If we've got baggage with someone?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it just shows how complex this whole thing is. But hold that thought for a minute, because there's another layer I want to throw in here. What about our own ability to actually, make expressions ourselves?
You mean like how expressive we are as people?
Kind of, but more like, what if we literally couldn't make a certain expression? Would that impact how well we recognize that emotion in others?
Well, now that you mention it, I actually remember reading something about that.
Right. It's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? But there's this study from 2016 by Wood, Rychlowska, Korb, and Niedenthal, and they actually tested this out. They used Botox to temporarily paralyze certain facial muscles in some of the participants.
So some people literally couldn't frown, even if they wanted to.
Exactly. They basically froze those muscles in place. And what they found was fascinating. Those who couldn't frown, they were actually worse at recognizing anger in other people's faces.
Whoa, seriously, that's kind of wild. Like, our brains need to actually feel the movement of those muscles to get it.
That's the idea behind embodiment, this concept that our bodies, they aren't just passively reacting to our emotions. They're actively involved in how we understand and experience those emotions in the first place.
So it's like, in order to really grasp an emotion, our brains are like, all right, let me try that on for size.
Exactly. Our brains use our own physical sensations as a reference point for understanding others.
Mind-blowing. It's like that saying, walk a mile in their shoes, is way more literal than we thought.
Right. And this whole embodiment thing goes even deeper than just facial expressions. Think about all the ways we use physical metaphors to describe our feelings, like feeling down or having a heavy heart.
Oh yeah, or butterflies in your stomach. We say that all the time.
And it's not just coincidence. Those metaphors, they're reflections of how our brains use bodily sensations to make sense of emotions.
So it's not just our faces, it's our entire physical experience that feeds into this whole emotional intelligence thing.
Exactly. And speaking of feeding into it, we got to talk about intensity for a sec. Because, it's not just about recognizing what emotions someone's feeling. It's also about how strongly they're feeling it.
Okay, so like a tiny little smile versus a massive beaming grin, those are going to hit different, right?
100%. Our brains are wired to zero in on the more intense stuff. There's this cool study from 2014 by Recio and his crew, and they showed this really clearly. They showed participants videos of faces slowly morphing from neutral into different expressions with varying levels of intensity.
Oh, cool. So they could see how the brain reacted to like a gradual increase in happiness or anger or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And they found that those stronger, more intense expressions, especially the negative ones like fear and anger, they caused a much bigger reaction in the brain, particularly in something called the EPN.
EPN. Sounds intense.
It stands for early posterior negativity. But you can kind of think of it like a brain alarm bell. It goes off when something grabs our attention, tells us to pay attention because it might be important.
So a big, dramatic, over-the-top scowl that's going to set off the EPN more than a subtle little frown.
You got it. It's like our brain saying, hold up, pay attention to this. This could be something we need to deal with.
And it makes sense, right? Like from an evolutionary perspective, those big, intense, negative emotions, those could be signs of danger. Better pay attention.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly scanning for threats in the environment. And even a fleeting but intense expression that can be a really valuable clue.
Wow, we've covered so much ground here. We've talked about how our brains see familiar faces differently, how our own ability to make expressions plays into it, and how intensity is a huge factor. But I feel like we've only scratched the surface of this whole embodied simulation thing. So let me get this straight. You're saying my brain is basically like an emotion simulator. It pulls from all my past experiences to try and figure out what's happening in other people's heads. It's kind of freaky when you really think about it.
It's pretty wild. And it gets even weirder because it's not even just about understanding other people. It's about understanding our own emotions, too.
Yeah.
Like our brain uses those same sensory simulations to make sense of what we're feeling.
Okay, hold on. So, like, when I'm feeling down and I say, ugh, I just feel so heavy, my brain isn't just being all metaphorical and stuff. It's actually pulling up, like, actual memories of physical heaviness to help me understand that abstract feeling of sadness.
You got it. Our brains are seriously amazing at making those connections between the physical world and these, like, abstract concepts. Those metaphors we use, they're not just random. They're clues to how our brain's processing everything.
This is mind-blowing. It's like our entire understanding of emotions is, like, rooted in our bodies and what they feel.
Pretty much. And it makes you wonder, right? Like, what about art or music? Can our brains use this whole embodied simulation thing to understand emotions in those contexts, too?
That's such a good point. I mean, think about how music makes you feel things. It's, like, deeply emotional, even if you don't always know why.
Exactly. And a lot of that comes down to, music is basically pure sensory experience, right? You've got rhythm, melody, harmony. It all taps into those same neural pathways that our brains use to create these embodied simulations of emotions.
So when a song makes me feel happy, it's because my brain's like, oh yeah, I remember this feeling, and it might have involved like dancing or sunshine or whatever.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly making connections, weaving together sensory stuff, memories, and those emotional responses, and boom, you've got meaning. It's why, like, a certain song can totally transport you back to a specific moment, bring back all those feelings.
It's so true. And that also kind of explains why what might be an emotional song for me might not do anything for someone else. Our brains are working with different sets of experiences.
Exactly. Our emotional responses to art, to music, they're super personal. They're shaped by everything we've been through, what we like, even our mood at that moment. Yeah. And that's what makes art so interesting to think about in this context, It's like a mirror reflecting our own inner world back at us.
This whole conversation has been such a trip. We started with those basic kind of funny emotion faces, and now we're here talking about our brains as emotion simulators. It's really amazing how much is going on under the surface.
It really is, isn't it? And if there's one thing I hope everyone takes away from this deep dive, it's just a sense of awe, really, at how complex, how intricate, how fascinating human emotion really is. We take it for granted, but it's the result of this incredible dance between our biology, our environment, the way our brains make sense of the world. It's incredible.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a good reminder that there's always more to learn, more to discover about ourselves and each other. So until next time, everyone, keep those brains buzzing, keep those bodies moving, and keep those emotions flowing.
We'll catch you on the flip side.